welcome on back to the GSMC Football Podcast. I am your host once again, Matthew Quinn. We are brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. We do have a very good show for you guys today. We'll be covering some season outlooks. We're going to stick to the NFC East, and we're going to have three different season outlooks for the NFC East, and the Giants, the Cowboys, and then the Commanders. We're going to save the Super Bowl champion Eagles for tomorrow's show. And also we've got some mock drafts that I'm going to go over as we continue that series on picks 26 through 30. And we'll be covering the last two of my mock draft in tomorrow's show as well. That's why I kind of wanted to combine the Eagles since they were one of the last two picks. And also later in the show, make sure you stick around as I'm going to also be giving you my top 5 college football teams that could surprise people. Doesn't necessarily mean they're going to win a national championship or anything like that. I just feel like these teams have a good chance of actually having a little bit of success next year in college football. So we'll get into that, and that's the last part of the show. But before we start, I would like to, as always, ask that you guys like and follow the show. If you got a question during the show that you want answered, just go into the super chat and type down your question or your comment, and then we'll get to it as soon as we can. And your input is a big part of what makes this show great, and we thrive on your energy and your insights. So whether it's a quick comment, a thoughtful question, or an opinion that you just have to share, don't hesitate to drop it in the chat. Now, if you do want to make absolutely sure that your message stands out and gets featured on the show, there's an easy way to do that. You can just use the super chat feature. Just click the $sign at the bottom of the chat box to send in your super chat. This guarantees that your message gets on the air, and it's also a fantastic way to support our channel. We rely on your support to keep bringing you the sports content that you love, and we do appreciate every single bit of it. So just go ahead, let us know what you're thinking, hit that super chat button, and let's keep this show interactive and exciting. And if you prefer, you can also go to gsmcsports.net to tip, donate, and leave a comment or a question there. And we couldn't do what we do without you guys' amazing support. So we're always so thankful to have you as part of our community. And again, the link for that super chat is gsmcpodcast.net. All right, so let's go ahead and get into the show here. We're going to go right into our season outlook series, talking about the New York Giants so far today. If you take a look at what they did last year, obviously it wasn't necessarily the best year last year. There was a whole combination of things that went wrong. Obviously, the whole Saquon Barkley thing that was actually filmed on HBO Hard Knocks between the GM, who's saying that he really didn't want Saquon Barkley to go to the Eagles and all that stuff. And then they ended up essentially choosing Daniel Jones over Saquon Barkley. And we all, of course, know how that turned out. But last season, they finished 3-14. They were dead last in the NFC East. They did cut Daniel Jones during the season, which just adds another layer to that Saquon Barkley fiasco that they had. And it's just a shame that they didn't wisen up and sign Saquon when they had the chance to, because he's doing great things elsewhere now. And now Daniel Jones is on his third team after he signed with the Indianapolis Colts in this offseason. So a big mess there for the Giants to try and pick up, and it's kind of part of the reason why Joe Schoen and to some extent Brian Daboll, the head coach, are kind of on the hot seat coming into this year. They really need to get the draft right, because if they don't and they have another disastrous season like it was last year, then it's, probably going to be it for both of those guys. They're probably not going to be retained. And it's a shame, because I do think Brian Daboll is a good head coach. He just hasn't really had a lot to work with in New York. Some bad management on the personnel side from the front office and all that has just kind of bled into, bad play on the field. So it's unfortunate, but he's probably going to get the axe if they have another year like they did last year, because they've got to see some improvement on this debacle, really, that the New York Giants are going through right now. But in terms of what they did last year, just statistically, they finished 28th in passing yards per game, 23rd in rushing, and 30th in total yards per game. So obviously the offense was not where you want it to be. There was a combination of Daniel Jones, who played about 10 games and had just over 2,000 yards with about 8 touchdowns and 7 picks. He also fumbled a couple of times too, but he played 10 games, and of course Tommy DeVito and Drew Lock played a couple games as well. But it just overall just was not a very good year for the Giants. The bright spot on offense, at least, was Malik Neighbors, the rookie wide receiver that they got in the draft last year. He ended up being a really, really good receiver. He had over 1,200 yards and 7 touchdowns. And just think what he could do with at least decent quarterback play on the New York Giants, depending on what they do in the draft, or if they maybe sign Russell Wilson or Aaron Rodgers or one of these guys. Maybe he gets even better numbers than he had last year, and that's saying something because he was very, very good last year. Now, as far as depth is concerned, they did re-sign Darius Slayton in the offseason, so that'll be a good, piece to keep on your roster, a veteran presence and all that. But don't be shocked if they go wide receiver at some point in the draft, if not early. Not sure, exactly what they might do, but, of course, they have the number 3 pick, so their options are pretty much wide open. Sort of feeling that they're probably going to go quarterback, though, depending on what shakes out in the draft with trades and things like that. They could go, quarterback, maybe Cam Ward if they trade up, because there has been talk that they could potentially trade up with the Titans to snag that guy. I don't know if that's going to happen so much anymore, as it's starting to become more and more clear that the Titans might just go ahead and select Cam Ward with that number 1 pick, and they may not trade it. But, of course, anything can happen between now and draft time. And then, of course, on draft night, a lot of things, trades and things of that nature usually happen on a draft night. A lot of surprising trades. So a lot of different things can happen. But defensively, they're in need of an upgrade defensively as well. They did have some positives on the defense. Dexter Lawrence, he led the team in sacks, and they were 7th in the league total in sacks. They were 8th against the pass, too, so their secondary was, pretty solid overall. Their problem really was run defense. Their run defense was not very good at all. They were 27th in the league in rush defense and in terms of yards allowed per game. So they need to get better that way. So they may go defense at some point in the draft. I wouldn't be surprised if they did, because it is, like I've said numerous times at this point, a very, very deep defensive line class in the draft. So even if they don't go defensive line with that 3rd pick, which I don't think they will, they could potentially, go somewhere like that in the later rounds, maybe 3rd round, 4th round, something like that, depending on what shakes out in the rest of the draft. But in terms of what their needs are, it's pretty obvious and apparent that, their need is a quarterback. But the situation is kind of different, because they could go with best player available sort of route, like some teams tend to do, and they could look towards next year as their year to go after their franchise guy. Maybe they sign one of those veterans that are still, kind of lurking out there, whether it be Aaron Rodgers or Russell Wilson or even Jameis Winston, who they had a visit with yesterday, I believe it was. So any of those options, they could go that route and then just go quarterback next year, because I don't think any of those veteran guys that are out there right now are a future quarterback for you. I mean, that's a 1-year bridge, 2-year max, depending on what guy you sign. Aaron Rodgers, I think, would just be a 1-year thing. I don't think he would last more than 1 year. Russell Wilson, probably more likely to be 2 years, but I still think it would be 1 year for him as well. And Jameis Winston, believe it or not, is actually the one guy that you could see him, being on the roster at least for more than 1 year. But the thing about Jameis Winston that scares a lot of people is how many interceptions he tends to throw. He's one of those guys that can be, have one of those games. It's like he's going to throw 400 or 500 yards and 5 touchdowns, but he'll also throw about 4 or 5 picks as well in that same game. He's just that kind of quarterback. I mean, you could say he's a gunslinger, but he tends to be a little reckless with the ball, which of course turns off a lot of head coaches. But his personality is pretty infectious. I mean, it would be fun to have Jameis on your team. He's usually a fun guy to watch at the very least, because you never know what you're going to get out of him, but you're going to get entertainment regardless. So if they go ahead and sign Jameis Winston, it'll probably be pretty cheap, and they can have him just run the team for a year and then just focus on their drafting of their franchise quarterback in next year's NFL draft, which is going to be a much better class quarterback-wise, with guys like Drew Aller and, of course, Arch Manning, guys like that. So they could be available. And wouldn't it be something if the Giants ended up with another Manning in terms of their quarterback? That would be pretty interesting to see for sure. But, A couple of other things that they did so far in this free agency, they did shore up that safety position at least a little bit with the signing of Javon Holland from Miami in free agency. They do need to upgrade the interior of that line. They did re-sign their interior guard, Greg Van Roten. He's about 35 years old now, though. He is a veteran lineman, and at this point, if you're with the Giants, you're trying to rebuild your team. You're trying to start from the ground up, essentially. You need new quarterbacks, all kinds of things. So you need an offensive line to protect whatever young quarterback you end up getting, whether that be this year or next year. If it's next year, then you definitely want to focus on upgrading that offensive line so that your next quarterback who comes in already has at least a decent offensive line and is not running for his life and developing bad rookie habits, as guys tend to do when they don't get a lot of time to throw the ball or anything like that. So they've got a lot of work to do, the Giants, but I could see them improving their roster a little bit at least, but it's all going to kind of hinge on what happens at quarterback. I don't think any of the available quarterbacks are going to take them to the playoffs or anything like that. Even if they draft a guy, say they get Cam Ward, I still don't think that he is going to lead them to the playoffs because there's just too many other things that the Giants need right now. But at the very least, you could have some positivity if you get Cam Ward and he shows some signs, of promise that he could potentially be a franchise quarterback for you. Then, of course, you got to take that as a positive. But if you're a New York Giants fan, I feel like you want to hedge all your bets on going franchise quarterback next season when it's a much better crop of quarterbacks, and maybe just get best player available with that third pick. You have plenty of players to choose from, at best player available with the number 3 pick. So, Travis Hunter could be the best player available for them. There's even been talk that Shedeur Sanders possibly at number 3. I don't know about that one. A lot of things have been said about Shedeur Sanders in a relatively negative light in this whole process of combine and scouting and, leading up to the draft and all that. Don't know if it's necessarily all fair, it's not necessarily all his fault or all of the, things that are coming out about him, but I don't think that should really affect his draft stock, but, it's not the world we live in, unfortunately. So teams look at any kind of negative thing and then they'll have them fall down on their draft board. But, Shedeur Sanders would be at least an upgrade over what they had last year, so, and they, if they add a couple other guys receiver-wise to pair with Darius Slayton and then, of course, Malik Neighbors, then, maybe they are scrappy a little bit, and maybe they get a little bit better, running the ball and just offensively in general. Of course, they need to be better defensively and, keep Dexter Lawrence, happy with, the rest of the defense around him. He's putting up numbers, getting a ton of sacks and everything, but the defense is still terrible against the run, then that doesn't really reflect him very well as the rest of the defensive front. So he needs to be better at run stopping as well as the rest of the our defensive line. So it's a full team effort, as everything in football usually is. So as far as what I think that they might do next year in terms of record prediction, again, it's all going to, be hinging on what they do in the draft or, quarterback-wise in their veteran free agencies, in terms of like Winston, Wilson, and Rodgers. If they get any of those guys or whatever, I don't, like I said before, I don't think that it's going to be much of a difference for the Giants. I do think that they could snag a couple of extra wins than they had. I don't think they have as bad a year as they had this past season. I mean, you can't really have much worse of a year unless you go completely winless, but I think that they could probably get to about 5, maybe 6 wins, depending on how things shake out with their quarterback situation. If they get Rodgers, who knows, maybe they can sneak 7 wins or something like that. Depending on how committed Aaron Rodgers wants to be to that Giants team if he decides to go there. But, so that covers it for the New York Giants. So when we come back, we're going to talk about the team that everybody loves to talk about, and that's the Dallas Cowboys. We're going to do a season outlook for them and what Jerry Jones might be thinking going into this upcoming season and in the draft and all of that. So just stick with us. We will be right back right after this, and we'll talk some more season outlooks.